I'm Mike Allen, and I was born and raised here in Ellensburg and went to college at Central. I'm a retired American history professor, and I taught at a lot of different places, but most of my career was at the University of Washington in Tacoma, Washington. About 21 years ago, we started a nonprofit called the Ellensburg Rodeo Hall of Fame Association to preserve the history and traditions of the rodeo, and that would include printed matter and printed records, but also three-dimensional artifacts. So there were these ranchers and cowboys who had been holding rodeos and little amateur rodeos, Sunday rodeos they called them, and the term rodeo comes from roundup. It's rodear is the Spanish for to encircle, and that's the verb, rodear. Rodeo is the noun. So roundups and cattle roundups, and so cowboys, that's one. Then there were the Kittitas Band of the Yakima Indians and other Yakima bands were very important in all of this because they loved to race horses, and they gathered in the valley every summer. That was part of their tradition, and they gathered and hunted here, and so they were very interested in being part of a rodeo so that they could continue those traditions. They came to dance and to race horses and gamble and feast and all the things that they like to do. And so you got cowboys and Indians then, who supposedly aren't supposed to go together, but in fact they're inextricably tied in the history of the West. And then you got farmers who aren't like ranchers, and there's overlap, but agricultural folks, that's different than cattle ranching. And they'd always had a fair, and that's part of rodeo too, a county fair. So you got three things going there. And then finally you got local businessmen and boosters and people who want to build a new modern economy revolving around something that we today call heritage tourism, which is a term they didn't use in 1923. None of the infrastructure was around at the arenas, where there weren't nearly as many places to sit. Probably 2/3 of the entire area didn't have an arena or didn't have a grandstand and seating. And there was just one main grandstand back then. And none of the bucking chutes or any of that kind of infrastructure was there. But fundamentally the same location at the base of that natural amphitheater, which is a spectacular place to have a rodeo right there underneath the towering cliffs of Craig's Hill. The South Grandstands were built in 1923, and they were restored through a state historic preservation grant in I think 2002 or 2003, somewhere around there. And so yeah, and all those old fair buildings are still, those are the fair buildings from the 1920s, But then as you move in a semicircle from that South Grandstand, and start to go like this, then you're getting into new grandstands and new infrastructure, and they're going to pull out the West Grandstands are probably going to go and be modernized, but those weren't built until the 1950s and 60s, so it's a real blessing that we still have that core of that old 1923 rodeo grounds, still there. The basic events are still here. There was bronc riding and calf roping and steer wrestling and races and wild cow milking. You may have heard of that before. Those events were in place, but then some other events came on along later. For instance, bull riding, which I think everyone, even people who don't know about rodeo today, they know about bull riding. Well, there was no bull riding in the 1920s, really until the late 1930s. They did ride on the backs of steers, but that's not like a Brahma bull, because those animals are bred, so they didn't have that. And I would say the difference is that all the events were specifically ranch related. They involve skills that you had to possess in order to be a working cowboy. And that's changed a little today. Events, for instance, like bull riding, no cowboy would get on the back of a Brahma bull. That's not something that a working cowboy would do. And you could also say the same of bareback riding. Cowboys rode broncs with saddles because that's how you trained a horse. That's how you broke a horse, was with a saddle. But you wouldn't get on bareback unless you were a daredevil. And so the events back then were more ranch related, but there's still an important ranch related connection today with rodeo. 2/3 of the events, maybe 3/4 in the arena, have direct connections to skills that cowboys needed in the 19th and early 20th century in order to work cattle. Yeah, well, I mean, there were always competitors from around town, but most of the, really high-level competition came from across the American West. And so they would always have local, like they always had a local calf roping competition for the local ropers. And before the war, they had a local bronc riding competition. And so how many cowboys came to compete? In those days, probably 200-300. And it's more than that now. And I mean, so many people came to compete that they had to start running what they call slack, which is competition before the actual show. And that way it's kind of like a semifinal or a semi-semifinal. And they still do this today. If you go down there at 9 o'clock in the morning on Friday or Saturday or Sunday, there's rodeo events going on, but they're not part of the show, they're slack. All of the great cowboys and cowgirls across North America came to Ellensburg at one time or another. There's really very few exceptions. But I'm thinking of one character in particular, a guy named Yakima Canutt. He was not Indian. He had that nickname Yakima. In fact, he was Scandinavian, and he was from Colfax. And he won the broncs here in 1925 or 26. He was a great bronc rider. But he went on then, and at that time movies were just coming in Hollywood, and they needed cowboys in Hollywood because they needed people who knew how to ride horses. He was a stuntman, and his most famous scene is that he drags from the stagecoach in John Wayne's movie Stagecoach, and he plays an Indian who John Wayne shoots, and he drags from the stagecoach. But where he really achieved fame was as a stunt producer, and he won Oscars for Ben-Hur and Stagecoach. And Pete Knight is a famous cowboy who rode broncs here, and Mabel Strickland from Walla Walla, she ended up in Hollywood also, and as a stunt rider. And she also competed, and there were women's events as well as men's events before World War II. Today, the only women's event sanctioned by PRCA, the Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association, is barrel racing. Before the war, there were segregated events for men and women, and so she roped calves, and she was a bronc rider, and then she was a trick rider, which was not an event or competition, it was an entertainment form. And she could jump automobiles with a horse. They'd bring in a couple of cars, It's like a motorbike rider today would jump over the tops of the car. Well, she did it with horses. And then the war came along, and because of rationing and wartime shortages, the government, I wouldn't say they passed a law outlawing sports events and public events, but people were strongly encouraged to participate in the war effort by saving fuel. So for example, all these cowboys and cowgirls who travel to rodeos, that's a great amount of fuel. It's also rubber for tires, which are necessary in a war effort. So what happened then, and I forget the dates exactly, I think it's 43 and 44, there was no Ellensburg rodeo. And so they had that lull. And then after the war, the rodeo came right back. And that period of time from 45 until about 1965 is, most sports historians call that the golden age of rodeo. Keeps us connected to our traditions and our folklore and folkways, and we really need that, because there's a lot in those traditions that's valuable, and it's a real blessing that we have this rodeo to keep us connected to that, because otherwise we'd forget. This combination of rodeo here and county fair you know, and going into that old fairgrounds and doing that. It's pretty special.